Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation to join you. What happened before the summit was a sequencing of, I would say, very rational and intelligent steps. And what happens after the summit has to follow the same trend. We started with developing our defense plans, agreeing on them, and then asking our military experts, our military authorities, our defense planners, what are the capabilities that we need to deliver on those plans. So actually the first step that got us to the Hague decision was the previous meeting of defense ministers that in the beginning of June agreed on the apportioned capability targets. So in essence, all allies agreed, yes, this is our job, these are our needs, and the leaders actually supported this with saying we are ready to spend 5% of GDP in order to make these capabilities a reality. Now, as you say, the harder work begins. But I agree with Minister Diaz that now it's easy to underestimate the difficulty of the summit, because I fully agree with him. If we have had this same meeting a month before the summit, 2 weeks before the summit, probably we would have dwelt in all the doomsday scenarios, right? Will they all be there? Will they all commit? Will the ironclad commitment to Article 5 be there? Will Russia as the main threat be mentioned? Will Ukraine be mentioned? Well, all these doomsday scenarios did not materialize, and the big message from the Hague Summit was the message of transatlantic unity, because we are aware that the threat is credible and that we have to do something dramatically different to deter it. Once the summit was over, the hard work of actually increasing defense spending, but also, as Minister Diaz mentioned, intelligent ways of spending and investing and reforming will be very important. Defense industry to be able to produce enough, and of course support to Ukraine, which will be and continues to be our line of defense. We are here in the city of Athens, if I'm not mistaken. It was Athena who was claimed to be the goddess of intelligent warfare. I think this is what we aim for. And I think that especially in the last year, NATO has shown how we envisage the Baltic Sentry, procuring unmanned drones, sending them to the Baltic Sea, because we have seen the consequences of the Russian shadow fleet, and doing this in the course of just a few months, deterring the threat and showing that we will respond in asymmetric way. This is a message that NATO is ready for the challenge and changing and being quicker in addressing it.
So let's accept, as I think most people, fair-minded people probably would, that this went pretty well compared with prior expectations, and you can be quite satisfied. But you also, I think, accept that the hard work starts now. And I'm curious as to how much of a roadmap there is for what you've just agreed upon. You know, the nitty-gritty, the granular detail of a more integrated, more rational, more flexible, more responsive defense with a much greater ability to harness the considerable resources that Europe has. How far is that planning process? You're very hot on planning at NATO. How far has that already gone, or are you only now going to really begin it in earnest?
Well, the capability targets were already around 30% more ambitious than the last ones, and not all allies delivered on the last one. So in a way, the bar is quite high. We know that this is a big ask from governments, from taxpayers, from citizens. But we all know that the threat that we are facing is completely different than 10 years ago. So as politicians do, we all adjust to the threat. We don't stand still. And what we know is that this continent has benefited and profited from the peace dividend. Now we hope that we will be also able to capitalize on the defense dividend. and it will depend.
What a wonderful world where you can have both peace dividend and defense dividend.
Well,
it's a win-win world.
We don't pick the times we live in, but we have to adjust to the real world.
Yes.
And what was real was the capability targets. There, I mean, Secretary General was already a bit more precise, but just mentioning 5-fold increase of air defense, it's not a small increase.
Right.
And so these things are written. Of course, we have said the capability targets have a certain kind of time frame. The 5% pledge plan should happen in the next 10 years. But quite a number of allies have made sure that their ambitious plans will actually deliver on the 3.5, which is related to the capability targets, in the next 4 to 5 years. And this is the approach that we want to see. We have said it is a sovereign decision on what is the path. And this time NATO was not so definite when it defined the targets. We are really aiming at effect. What the minister was saying, let us find a more innovative solution to the threat, to the approach, to the plan, the implementation of the plan. And this is how we hope to marry innovation with defense industry. But the focus in the next period will not be just governments delivering. It will be also very much defense industry delivering, because we have heard quite a number of allies saying, we go to the defense industry, to the producers, we commit, we are interested, the demand signal is clear, not only because of the summit, but because of the capability targets. And then they tell us, okay, you can come back in 5 years or in 10 years. And this is something that we want to avoid, and this is why we had this big industry event at the Hague Summit, because this is the expectation, and this is, I do believe, a joint interest, defense industry and allies, on producing more, producing better, producing smarter, and really doing this mixture of innovation and typical defense industry, let's say.
Well, Sir Patrick, I think someone with your background, one would look to for some sort of hard-nosed realism and pragmatism to this set of challenges. How do you see the implementation, the challenge of implementation of what NATO has set out, and where would you imagine the kind of crunch points lying?
So I think anybody who attended that summit would bank that as a win. And you can point to things like Spain's refusal to commit to 5% as sort of breaking some of the cohesion and unity that was shown, but broadly speaking, it was a win. But all of the discussion was about a number. It was about 3.5% and 1.5%. And I'm much less interested in inputs, and I'm interested in the outputs, the capabilities. But I'm particularly interested in their relevance over time, because this is only meaningful if you can deter the enemy that we are up against, which of course is Russia, and all of the intelligence estimates that we have suggest that from whenever they begin to cease or draw down operations in Ukraine, who knows when that'll be, it's between 2 and 5 years before they can regenerate and rearm, and at a much faster pace than we can. And that gives you a window of vulnerability that probably looks around some period between 2027 and 2030. And Russia is not going to advance or attack NATO on a broad front. It's going to look for an opportunity to align its imperialist, expansionist ambitions with the opportunity to undermine NATO cohesion. And that takes you to places like Svalbard, it takes you to the Baltic states, who have very little depth, it takes you to some of the islands in the Baltic, and it takes you potentially to Kaliningrad. And there they can achieve overwhelming local superiority, achieve some limited objectives, and then sit back behind a nuclear umbrella and dare us to respond. If that coincides with a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, we're doing all of that without the support of the United States. So it's the time frame that really counts. And in that respect, I was disappointed that the milestone that we set ourselves was 2035, and there wasn't really a series of performance metrics that got you there.
So the threat could be ultra high before NATO is ready to meet it, in fact.
And what we're talking about here is a minimum viable product.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the technical superiority and everything that we were discussing. It's doing enough to deter Russia. And in that respect, we talked about the plans. I mean, these are plans that we signed up to 2 years ago at Vilnius. The acid test of the success of this summit, the outcome, is will SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, have been provided the capabilities he needs for those plans by 2030? And if the answer to that is no, then we're not succeeding in deterring Russia.
And do you think there's an element of this that is not just about the money and about the commitments up front, but is it about the strategy and the way you deploy the resources that you have to make, well, as you put it, the minimum viable product enough, sufficient to deter what Russia might view as NATO's weak, not underbelly exactly, but overbelly, because you're describing it all in the north. So.
It is, and we're not talking about complex systems here. We will try to get innovative. It's all about how you can make existing platforms that we have, because we're not going to be able to replace them in that sort of time frame, much, much more lethal than they are at the moment. So that is draping a sort of software, autonomous, lethal systems mix on top of existing legacy fleets of platforms that we have. But it's also, crucially, making sure that, that our stockpiles can keep us sustained for more than a few weeks. Yeah. Because candidly, that's where we are. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is that these wars are protracted. So if you're going to be credible in deterring Putin, ultimately it will be about your technological edge and your readiness. But in the short term, and that's the threat we have to address, it's are you credible so that Putin looks over the border at Narva and he goes, not today. And we just keep stringing those not todays out until we've achieved the sort of superiority that we're capable of, because there's not a lack of money. It's all about the implementation.
Yeah. Now, do you accept this basic critique that the timing is off here, that this is not to undermine the achievements of the summit, but that there is a problem with the sequencing of when the money comes and when the increased spending kicks in, and when the threat, the timescale or potential timescale of what that threat is?
On one side, yes, there were more ambitious, let's say, goals, reaching these targets, or at least the 5% target in 2030 or 2032. But perfect is the enemy of the good, especially in politics, especially at a level of 32 important allies that have to reach a consensus. So I do believe that the important thing was that we have reached the consensus, and a number of allies have set actually more ambitious goals. And I think this is what matters. And once the whole system, the whole process starts, I mean, we will be able to do fine-tuning, because there were some legitimate concern by certain allies that if we have really a timetable of 5 years, and we all go to more or less the same defense producers, and we say now we are interested in a contract, we will just inflate the prices. We won't be able to commit the money in the first few years, and we will still end up with what we call a hockey stick curve. So the idea and the expectation is that allies, most of them, are very serious, not because of just a NATO commitment, but also because of the clear threat perception. And the decisions that were made, especially in the east, in the north, I mean, Poland is already there, the Baltic states, the Scandinavian countries have increased dramatically the defense spending. German decision raised at the sessions before us was, I mean, it's historic.
Yes, but there are two areas of this that when it comes to implementation, apart from the sequencing that you mentioned, that are going to be very difficult. And one of those is the implication that if you do it smartly, some countries are going to miss out on some elements of their defense manufacturing. That's the logic of rationalization of the European industry. That's one. And the second is that when the money, it really comes down to the money, you have a very hard conversation about the social policy or social budgets which budgets are going to be sacrificed in order to make way for the increased military spending. So how do you see that those two issues are going to be tackled? Because they're both essentially, they come down to political courage, political explanation, and not always easy. Easier said than done.
No, and I'm very conscious of the irony as a Brit standing here sort of lecturing NATO about the sequencing of the timeline. And it's fair to say, I think that my government's position was to push it further to the right rather than accelerate it to the left. So we're not exemplars in the way that Germany has been, and clearly the Scandinavian and the Baltic states have been. But the flip side to that, and as is being played out very publicly if you follow British politics, we can't even agree on a relatively simple measure around reducing social spending. And so there's very little hope for how we're going to find ourselves through this. But I point to, a number of comments that have been made in a previous session, or several sessions, which is, look to the countries that do this well. Look to Finland, look to Sweden, look to the Baltic states, look to Poland. Those are countries who, because of their geography and history, have an acute sense of the inevitability of a threat from Russia. And it's not when, it's if. Sorry, it's not if, it's when. These are also, funnily enough, the countries that have among the highest happiness indexes in the world. So there is a correlation between things like national service, national security and national defense, and productivity and national happiness. The point is that because we suffer from contemporary amnesia, we've lost the ability to make those arguments. And that is what needs to be done in Western Europe and in the UK. I've answered part of your question.
I think that's very good for now. The other part was on the social policy front.
It's always, as I said, it's a big ask, and it's always a difficult decision. And it's not a question of choice, actually. It's a question of necessity. But because if you look at Ukraine defense spending now, 30%. Russia, allegedly 10%. Many people say much higher. So the goal, the message, the aspiration.
But you say it's necessity, but I mean that perception isn't, for example, shared in Spain, quite evidently. So there is a job to be done in explaining people.
Yeah, I remember some of the same dilemmas before 2022 and before 2014. And we might like it or not, but those of us who claim that the threat is there and real have been proven right. And I think that the wishful thinking that suddenly these imperialist, aggressive policies will suddenly stop is a bit naive, and all of our intelligence reports actually prove that this is the case. So the idea is investing so that we can prevent, we can deter war. I come from a country and a region that still remembers war. And I know that in the moment when you lose peace and stability, everything, all the economics, all the GDP numbers and the percentages, they disappear. So I think what we need is, and this is where allies come in, an honest conversation with our public. And what we have seen is that the public appreciates the honesty. Every politician would have had a much easier time going out in front of their constituents and saying, and now we will spend all this money elsewhere. And we have done it for many, many years. And now this is the time when we need to invest in what everyone considers granted, and this is peace and stability. So I don't disagree that this is a difficult discussion. I believe that it is a necessary one.